Welcome back to another episode of the Buried Bible Podcast, where we are exploring the Bible through the ancient lens. This is going to be our wrap-up portion of the ancient Near East, setting the stage for the Bible. And so in this episode, we're just going to kind of go through what we've talked about, what we've discussed, have some follow-up questions, and to dive into more of like the application of some of the things that we've learned. So again, if you still have further questions on this, please reach out to us, let us know, so that we can answer some of those questions either in later episodes or even make a whole episode just for you guys answering your specific questions. And so we just want to overview and kind of go through and digest and debrief what we've talked about. So if you haven't already watched those episodes, we encourage you to go and do that. But yeah, we're going to dive in, again, finishing up on the ancient Near East. And so we talked about a lot. So, I mean, there's a lot that we could ask. There's a lot of places and different avenues we could go to. But again, I think we'll pull back for the sake of this episode. Again, getting ready to go into the creation accounts. So, based on our last episode, we discussed and talked about you have all these different people groups, and they're capturing other people groups, defeating other people groups. And that can just seem like, okay, well, the Babylonians came over here and defeated the Assyrians, or vice versa. And this people group went to war with this group. We just say, okay, it's just a bunch of craziness going on. But there's some real big specifics that we can even pull out of it through the Bible narrative itself. And so would you talk about why are these people, these different people groups, attacking, trying to capture, trying to expand beyond just growth of kingdom? And then what were some of the influences that would have on the people group that was captured, right? We're going to see that Israel's going to go to war with these different people. But when you would capture or when you would defeat an enemy, like what did that mean to that people group? Like what would they do? What were they forced to do? What customs were they forced to change? Again, it doesn't have to be everything, but like from a generalized perspective.
I suppose when I answer this, it's really not that different than any other period in history. And so you think about it, if think of what's happening in Syria right now. Okay, they decided the rebels who have taken over do not want the Iranian presence in their country, and so they're trying to remove that and establish their own cultural independence and religious independence. And I know it's infinitely more complicated than that. And so they're responding against that. In the Bible, for example, in 2 Kings, when Hezekiah's father Ahaz, he's a subject of the Assyrian king. He has not been officially conquered, but he's paying him tribute. In fact, if I was a king, a bad king, and I wouldn't want to spend the effort in actually conquering your kingdom and using all of my troops to post them everywhere. That would take a lot of work, because then I wouldn't be able to conquer other areas. I wouldn't have the troops. But it would be good for me to make you tributary in that. And really, what do I want when you're tributary? I want you to be able to send me your best revenue that you have. And as long as I keep on getting that revenue, I pretty much don't care how you operate. In other words, I want to make sure, like they said about Mussolini, as long as the trash is picked up and the trains are on time, we're satisfied with it, until they weren't, of course. But the point is that I want stability. And you also, by the way, see this in New Testament times. Rome doesn't want to conquer Jerusalem and destroy the city. The effort involved was just unimaginable. But since it was such an unstable region, they had to come in and occupy it directly, put in their own governor. The name of the most infamous of all these governor, Pontius Pilate. We know that he ruled from 26 to 36. But so I want to benefit from being in your area without having to extend all of my resources. But there's also an ideological part to it here. I'm doing this under the auspices of the king of the gods, Ashur, if I'm an Assyrian. And it's not, but I'm not a monotheist. I recognize, for example, if you're from the kingdom of Judah, that your particular God probably has sovereignty over there. And this is why, for example, Isaiah will say to, uh, he's writing to, of course, Israelites, but he's saying that, think about Isaiah between about 7 through 10, where he says, I'm going to bring Assyria to attack you, and then I'm going to judge him for coming. And then, of course, in the dialogue between the Rabshakeh in 2 Kings 18, yes, 2 Kings 18, the Rabshakeh is dialoguing with the people on the city wall in Jerusalem. He says, hasn't your God called us to come here and attack you? And he wasn't wrong. He was, of course, manipulating this for his own purposes, but they understood that there was this propagandistic or ideological perspective where we're coming here and even your God is allowing it. And of course, for them, being polytheist, each divine being might have sovereignty over an area. And so if we come and conquer your area, Yahweh has encouraged us to do it. He's probably angry at his own people. And the Assyrians in the north, when they conquered Samaria, they took the upper classes and deported them, and they naively assumed, you want to come to our lands, we're going to give you benefits. In fact, the Rabshakeh, when he's talking to the Jews later on, he says, yes, you're going to be deported, but you're going to have your own vineyard and you're going to have your own, it's going to be a good life. What's your problem? But Hezekiah rejects that overture, whereas the previous ruler Ahaz not only accepted it, he went to Damascus and looked at the altar up there because he wanted to be more attuned to what the Assyrians were like. In other words, he wanted to become more like an Assyrian. In the sense that you think about it, how did America do its foreign policy, especially in the Western Hemisphere, the Monroe Doctrine? And so I'm coming to your South American country or Latin American country, and as long as you're espousing democracy, we'll be kind to you. But if you start taking on governmental forms that are alien to us, that we don't like communism or whatever, there's going to be agitation here. And so if you prop up a dictator in Nicaragua, we're going to be more interested in you espousing a democratic forms. By the way, this is, not, of course, much more complicated than this, and I'm well aware that America was and has been a country that doesn't always abide by its ideological presuppositions, but that's neither here nor there, nor were the Assyrians. And so if I'm the southern kingdom of Judah, and by the way, Canaan, where the Israelites and the Judeans are living, that's a cultural backwater. You know how I know that? So we have 500,000 cuneiform tablets, maybe from Iraq, 100,000 in Turkey, 100,000 in Iran, and about 100, not 100,000, about 100 in Palestine. In other words, you get to about Megiddo in the north, or northern Israel, and the cuneiform writing tradition almost abruptly stops. We find almost nothing in the south, and maybe a couple fragments of tablets in Jerusalem from the late Bronze Age. But the point is that it was outside the political center, however, and it was a cultural backwater. But culturally speaking, the Israelites, first of all, recognized their Mesopotamian roots, and I brought that up very, very early. And secondly, linguistically, they were connected to the Assyrians and Babylonians. And culturally speaking, it's all part of a greater ancient Near Eastern continuum. I suppose it would be like, China has been looked upon as sort of like a cultural core, but politically speaking, there's lots of different types of states, and northern China was dramatically different than southern China, but you could recognize this Chinese cultural core. You could see the same thing in the ancient Near East. Multiple different people groups, a bewildering amount, some of them completely unrelated to each other linguistically, but they had this Sumero-Akkadian core, And in the outlying areas, and that's certainly Palace, the coastal areas were still a part of this. And so you could recognize, at least on a superficial level, that they were part of this, this cultural continuum. They had their own eccentricities, and that certainly is true. But the biblical participants are part of this ancient Near Eastern cultural core. And so when you study Mesopotamia, you're studying the core, by the way. Not that it's better, it's just that it's a centerpiece. And so if you're studying the American civilization, but it's 5,000 years from now, you're going to see, the cultural cores seem to have been in the early periods, New York and Philadelphia and Boston, and then there seems to be a core over here at a place called Hollywood. And we're not quite sure, and then there's other cores cropping up, but then there's what, then they would make fun of the place that we call flyover country. And of course, we're very sensitive about that, in these parts, but, um, but it's all part of the same cultural continuum, I suppose. I don't know if I answered it directly, but so they're part of the cultural continuum, but it's not as if the Assyrians are coming to Judah and saying, all right, you need to be just like us. No, all they care about is that you make allegiance to us. And it's not unlike Rome in the sense that you can probably do you have to make allegiance to Ashur? Well, yeah, I mean, in the sense that we're the Assyrians. Do they really understand the difference between them and what the Assyrians are, what the Israelites are believing about the exclusivity of their God? We don't know. We really don't know that eccentricity. That certainly comes out rather dramatically in the Roman period with the Jews and of course the Christians in the frustration where, all I want you to do is simply ally yourself with the Roman emperor. No, but he claims to be divine, so I can't do it if I'm a Christian. But that's all we're asking you to do. No, I can't do it. Well, then you're a rebel. And do we have that in the ancient Near Eastern world? It's sort of foggy. But I want you to ally it with, and of course, if you're Jewish or an Israelite, you probably want to, in a sense, because you're going to get by well, and it doesn't, how strong of believers are they? We really don't know. The about 200 tablets from the British Museum and elsewhere were recently translated that shows that when the upper class Jews were deported from Jerusalem to Babylonia, they actually made out pretty well. They're buying and selling. They're upper class merchants. They've got slaves, and we know that they live in a place called Judah Town. We're not exactly sure where it was, but it was within the vicinity of Babylon. But they're doing well, and have they kept their own identity? Yes, to a certain extent, but 100 years later, when Nehemiah and Ezra are returning, not everybody wants to go back home because it's a cultural backwater, and we've been here a century, and we're doing quite nicely. And in fact, there's been Jews in Babylonia all the way up to modern day Iraq. There were Jews there to the present day, and in fact, Iranian Jews and others. In fact, I met a number of them after the revolution. They became my students in Southern California.
Okay, and then the next question would be, which I doubt there's anybody listening if they don't care about these things, especially like the details. And when you're talking about the language and the different ancient civilization and different people groups, some though, maybe somebody watching will be like, well, how like pertinent is that to the Bible? Because I think us postmodern or just evangelical Christians as a whole, when we think context, it's kind of like a quick overview. Okay, what's kind of happening here, but we don't understand the significance of truly understanding the role that the ancient world has on the Bible itself and the Israelite people. So I guess I'll chunk this into two, which would be, as a quick overview, like how much influence do these other cultures truly have on the people in the Bible? Specifically, like Israel, you know what I mean? Because I think sometimes it's kind of easy to be like, well, there's Israel and the bad guys, and we kind of story play it like that. But how much is it kind of intertwined
I'm
similarity?
I'm gonna if you're all right with this, I'm gonna try to reframe that. It's not so much that they have so much influence on them. It's the fact that they're all part of the same cultural continuum. Okay, so it. I mean, if you're from a backwater area, and I'm from New York, and you're from some rural Kansas or whatever, we're all part of the same cultural continuum. We all eat at McDonald's. We all hate the Yankees or what I'm saying is that we we all have some general characteristics that will be understandable to each other. Even if let's say you're Hispanic or whatever, there are going to be some general similarities. First, because we're living in the same century, we're living in the same area, we drive on the same interstates, etc. And so the same thing is happening in Israel. Israel is not. It's not so much that they're influenced by all these other people groups. They're part of this. They're part of it. And so this is why when we start looking at, let's say, law codes, it's not as if Moses was sitting there, man, I need some good laws. That Hammurabi code, that really is cool. Let me take a few of those. No, it's part of his whole, it's already part of his world. They're, the Israelites framed their laws just like the Babylonians framed their laws. There's no other way to frame them. Just like, I don't know whether I brought it up here before, but because I don't have a good memory, but you if you look at a legal code in Central Iowa from 1840, and then you look at a legal code, from Maine in 2024, you're saying there's a lot alike here. There's certainly a lot alike compared to our codes in 5024. How did that happen? And you're saying, well, of course, they're part of the same cultural legal. They're all part of the same legal culture. And so the Israelites are part of the same legal culture. Now, there is some really, really deep differences, but it takes time to figure that out. And that's what we'll do later on. But on the surface, an Israelite doesn't look that different from a Canaanite. And you're thinking, wait a minute, the whole point of Leviticus is to show that we're supposed to distance ourselves from those people. Well, you know why? Because it wasn't very easy to do it. The Canaanite, in fact, you know what the Canaanite spoke? Biblical Hebrew, except let's put it this way, it's the same language, different dialect. If you go to graduate school, let's say, at a Ivy League school or UCLA or whatever, and you want to study Biblical Hebrew, they're going to throw in some Ugaritic and Canaanite and other things but they're writing pretty much the same language, and scholars will argue whether it's simply different dialects or not. But it's hard to tell them apart. If you're an outsider, you're not going to be able to tell a Canaanite from an Israelite too easily until you start interrogating them and finding out, oh, when I start scratching in the surface, there really is a difference between these people, but it's a deep one. The one on the level is similar. And so for me to understand this world, it opens up the Bible in a different way. I begin to realize, oh, they're part of a real culture. These are not, I think as a kid you get the idea that the Bible is sort of suspended in space somewhere, or maybe it was handed down from heaven, and so it's in this cultural bubble that it's untouched by anything else. But that's not how God operates. And why would God want to operate that way? He operated in real time with real people. And so, and so even if I brought this up before, I think it bears repeating. If God decided that he was going to give his holy oracles to you and I today, it would be in English with cultural paraphernalia that would make sense in 2024. Football analogies, sports analogies, analogies about interstates and food and other things that would be understandable to the average person. And so that's what's going on when the Bible was being written, except that we've got, a couple millennia worth of
Mhm.
stuff to deal with. And so it and so how deep do you need to go? It's entirely up to you, in terms of
Mhm.
interest, because this isn't mandatory, uh, but it just makes things, I think, more interesting and more fruitful. And again, it's like watching a black and white TV and then finding one in living color that's, high definition. It's like, wow, this is so neat. I don't want to go back to that now.
Mhm.
I see all the detail that I couldn't have seen before. Um,
Yeah.
it's so
I mean, that makes sense to me because, yeah, I do think we kinda put it on a shelf by itself, but, yeah, in the same way as if we were to receive some oracle, we can only speak how we speak and think through the lens that we think through. Like, we can't think outside of ourselves, we only can understand what we do know,
yeah,
and so that's familiarity, and I know some people kinda have problems with the historical context because then they go, "Yeah, but then it for whatever reason, it's like the opposite end of the coin of it almost takes away God's sovereignty or divinity, where to me it's A, the beautiful thing already is what's God's instrument for the world? People. Now, if I was God, I think there's a much better way. I think God could do a lot better than me, right? Like, but it's the beauty of God's sovereignty of, "No, I'm choosing to partner with you to use people for
yes,
my means, that we're blessed to then be a blessing."
yes,
I don't think that diminishes God's sovereignty because it's right. Because everyone's like, "Well, why doesn't he just show up then?" Well, I mean, there's a lot of theological problems with that of, like, no faith and, so if God were to just come down, which he did do, then you would believe. But I think it's the beauty of his sovereignty, not the lack of it. In the same way
yeah,
of them writing their own language and their own cultural whatever, speaking to people that would have understand what they're saying, and they're understanding it through the brain capacity that they can understand it, and then that God still speaks, that it's still alive and active, speaks to the magnitude and the beauty of his sovereignty that he can actually still work through that and speak through that, as opposed to just almost writing it in a God language, and then we all just get it. Like, it
yeah,
is a God language, but in our own language.
yes. And so it behooves me to realize, oh, so God's speaking in real time to a real group of people in a real language. And so the first thing I want to do, and by the way, this is any historian, this isn't unique to the Bible. You want to be able to understand what's going on in that time period. That will basically strengthen my understanding of it. It also shows that that I have to recognize there is a disconnect. The Bible, like I mentioned, I think in the first session, the Bible was written for us, but not to us. And so there is that disconnect that I want to try to restore. It doesn't mean that that it's not a complete disconnect. It just means that I can understand it better. It's not a requirement. I don't want you to think of it that way. It's sort of icing on the cake. The Bible wasn't written in English. It was written in real languages. And so somebody, if you want to be authoritative, you learn those languages. And so when you hear something that seems to be odd or theologically suspect, then somebody can go back and look and say, wait a minute, that's not what the text says. um, here's language and here's grammar, and that's really no different than any historian. If you're studying Herodotus or a Chinese historian or whoever it might be, you need to try to understand the mind of the times. Even if you're listening to a piece by Beethoven or whatever, you want to know, well, what's going on in 1820 when he's doing this or that. What's happening in the world even today. I mean, uh, in our political scene or military scene or whatever, what's happening in December of 2024 is really significant. It is shaping what we're like, and so why wouldn't it
Mhm.
be with the Bible? It doesn't diminish it at all. It just means that God, like you said, He condescended to meet us where we were at, okay,
Mhm.
with His Word. And you think, and then the ultimate, of course, is him deciding to incarnate, to become human, and and try to explain that. I mean, children will ask you a question. I'm thinking, I can't answer your question, but let me see if I can say something that will make sense. And of course, never satisfying, um, you know, to a child. And I'm thinking, well, it's really not satisfying to me either. I don't understand how God could become a man and still stay God.
Mhm.
And what does that mean? 100% man, 100% God. Well, that's God condescending. And so he condescends with his word, which was put in real time and real space. And so my goal is is spending my life, my adult life, trying to understand that context, ultimately for devotional purposes.
Right. Yeah.
Okay, to understand what God is really trying to tell me in the best way I can.
Yeah. Which is, again, yeah, a beautiful way to put it, that there is a depth to the context, there's a depth and a richness, but really what it is it's continuing to draw closer to who Jesus is and knowing him more deeply.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that's a good analogy. We'll leave it there. I guess my last one would be, it's like my wife, right? I've been married for 7 years. There's still much more to explore, and there's still more beauty in it. I don't just go, "Well, that's my wife," and then I'm done exploring because I know that fact about her, right? Like, there's more to it. There's intrinsic little characteristics and different, like, unique perspectives, and it's for her, it's gonna change over time and different days and different weeks, and she went through this, or she had this day at home with the boys. Like, I never get done, um, understanding who she is and falling more in love with her and the beauty of my wife. It's like, why would we think it or associate it any different with God when the name God should probably encapsulate something
Who's
beyond?
infinite.
Right, who's
Yeah.
infinite. So that's beautiful. And then I guess my follow-up to that, because we talked about the people groups, if you could quickly talk about if somebody's being like, "Yeah, okay, but why is the language?" And you spent so much time on language. Why is language so important? Because we just read our Bible in English or we read a translation, and we read my kinda segue to kind of better explain where I'm coming from is before we were talking about, Jesus hypothetically maybe as the gardener, right? Well, when I read that and then I get the English translation, I go, Okay, the from the Septuagint, the Greek word there means garden." Okay, well, so I know the language. It's like, no, I don't, because when I think garden, I think about planting tomatoes and blueberries, and that couldn't be further from the actual context the language in Greek had in and of itself. Greek and then Hebrew. What garden meant then is far beyond what I understand, because I'm just getting the English translation so I can make it make sense. So there's a context to the language itself and the role that language plays and even shapes our worldview, which I guess we won't dive that deep into it, and I hope this makes sense to people, but our framework and our viewpoint and our understanding is actually framed in through language itself, that we can only ever understand so much by language. And there's a context and uh, a way of knowing and understanding that language plays into that just beyond pure understanding, if that makes sense. And so talk about why the actual context to language is so important beyond just the words.
First of all, I will say this. If you have the understanding of the Bible as a 4-year-old, you're good to go. And so in other words, a 4-year-old who knows that Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. I would say everything else emanates from that. And so you're good to go. And if you never go any further than that, uh, that's fine. In other words, I mean, I hope you do, but the point is that this is not as if it's so fundamental that oh, you have to know the languages, otherwise you're missing out. That's not the case. But since I make the argument that God did speak and write in real time, he did see fit, and the New Testament writers saw fit to to allow, or at least the early church I should say this, the early church encouraged people to take the Bible and put it in their own language. They just wanted to get the word out, the good news. Oh, you don't know Greek? Okay, let's put it in your language, whether it's Ethiopic or you know um, or Latin, or whatever it might be. Let's put it in your local language, and then you can read it.
Mhm.
And by the way, people didn't have books. There might be scrolls. If you wanted a scroll of Matthew and I'm a scribe and you say, well, I'd like to have a scroll of Matthew. I said, well, it'll probably take me a month to do a good job. And so it'll be a month's worth of salary. And you're thinking, I can't pay you a month's salary. I said, well, I could do a summary for you, or maybe just the first chapter, or, what I'm saying is that people don't have a lot of, a way, they don't have access to this easily. And so the church was willing. Now in Islam, by the way, they prefer you to learn Arabic and keep it in the original text. The biblical writers did not see it that way, especially with the Old Testament. The Old Testament was translated into Greek in a period before Christ, and one of those Greek translations is the one that Keegan brought up, the Septuagint. We may have occasion to talk about later on. So in other words, since the Bible was written in real language, mostly biblical Hebrew, that sort of sounds redundant, Hebrew, but it's the Hebrew of the Bible is the Old Testament. There is some Aramaic sections of Daniel and other books in the Old Testament. For the most part, the New Testament is written in Greek by, I would say, pretty much every author in the New Testament does not have Greek as their first language, by the way. And so it's sort of interesting there too. They're writing with other thought processes going on. And if that doesn't make any sense, if you speak and if English is your original language, you think and breathe, and you even perceive the world in your English language, but it's a different worldview in Spanish. And I don't know if I brought this up before, but I think it bears repeating. Just think of Spanish. You say it's cold in Spanish, you hace frío, and that doesn't mean exactly the same thing. The verb's different, and there's no subject to it because the implied subject is God, and it sort of betrays a pre-scientific worldview about the fact that God is interacting with the world to make it cold. But of course, when I say it's cold, there's no agent. It's like, it just happens to be cold. And so that's how the natural process is. And so even if I believe in God, he's not intimately involved in how this is working. At least that's since the scientific revolution. So there's a big difference there. When I learned a little bit of Arabic, I began thinking in Arabic when I was out in the field with my workers. I'm like, what's going on here? And of course, it was really, really infantile, but I said, that's different. And of course, even cognates in language, if you're Spanish and I borrow a word from you and put it in my own language, I form it into my own image. And I don't just take the exact meaning. I have another cultural attribute over here, and I modify it. And so when you translate something, you've already reinterpreted it. Okay, this is why you can't create a dogmatic theology of the Bible from an English translation. Even the King James, great translation, a little out of date now, but the point is that you are dealing with something that has been interpreted by other people. And so I have to realize that. And so if I want to be precise as I can, and I want to be authoritative, then I would want to learn biblical Hebrew and Greek. Now others have even gone further. Well, I'm really interested in the background world, and so I learned Sumerian and Akkadian. That's a little extra. But just to learn those basic languages, to realize that when you translate from language A to language B, you are using an interpretive process. And that's why there are lots of different, versions and translations. And just like you said about the word for garden, the Greek word for garden, paradiso, it comes from Iranian words for the gardens that the monarchs in Mesopotamia and in Iran created for themselves. That's analogous to the garden that was put in Eden. It's a beautiful we get the word paradise from. Not every garden's a paradise, obviously, but it makes you think. When you're thinking of the word, it gives you a different thought, and even in English, if you look up a dictionary, you find out, oh, this word actually has 6 different meanings, and they're not all the same. And which one was I using in this context? Uh, you know, uh, and so words and language mean a lot, and so you have to be a student to if you're going to get into the theological weeds and really understand why I believe something, you want to find out. It's not just learning about one word, it's learning about the whole process of how these words interact
Yeah.
and what they mean. It's just a lot of work.
Because garden, I mean, I'm infantile in my understanding of that, but from the Old Testament, yeah, then it goes beyond that, right? I'm going to take you to the promised land, the land that's flowing with milk and honey,
Yeah.
that it's going to be this place of, again, it's not just, okay, well, it's a place for this. Well, yeah, but now the meaning behind that of, no, you're not going to lack anything.
Yeah.
It's going to be lush. You're going to have water, and the importance of having that stuff is lost on us 21st
Yeah.
century postmodern people, right? We just turn on our faucet and here comes water. But like, you would lack nothing. You would have everything. It's paradise. You have water flowing and vegetation and fruit and food to eat. And so even that kind of has like a back context to itself. So,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess my last one, in case people are just kind of catching us on this episode before we go into other specific topics, would be a quick general overview of the ancient Near East, but maybe stick to like the big thematic things. I know through our first few episodes, you've already said, okay, you're trying to sum up thousands of years and the differences, but from like a major thematic point, what was the role of like ancient deities, religion? What was like the highest order that they thought of? What was most important to them? Their kind of outlook on humanity. I'm not asking you to describe all of it, but just like, this was the chief end of our civilization. Here's how we looked at humanity, and then the role of.
Well, this is actually a good segue to looking at the creation epics, because if you're a typical Babylonian, and somebody, let's say a child says, "Daddy, why are we here?" Now if you're Hebrew and I ask, "Daddy, why are we here?" They're going to probably say, "Well, read Genesis 1, this is how God, started everything." Okay, so how did you and mommy get together? Well, that's Genesis 2. And I'm, of course, being very simplistic. And then, well, why do you and mommy always fight? Oh, that's Genesis 3. And of course, I'm being facetious here, but the point is that I'm on one level, I think the beginning chapters of Genesis are asking basic questions that any human is going to ask when they start becoming aware of their role in the world. Like, okay, so I'm here, and it looks as if the nature seems to be in war with me because it rains, it gets really cold, and there's a thunderstorm and an earthquake, and gee, it's really bad out there, and somebody was mean to me the other day, and I didn't like that, and because of it, I was mean back to them. I didn't like myself when I got mean. Well, why isn't everything just nice? Like, why aren't we just nice to each other? And I mean, these are really infancy questions, but the thing is that, are we any different as adults in our answers? Maybe we have sophisticated answers, but why is there evil in the world? And so the biblical writers have an answer, and it's very, very different than the answer that we get from Mesopotamia. Even though they look alike, they dress alike, they speak alike, their laws seem to be alike, their answers are very different behind the scenes. And so in Mesopotamia, being polytheistic, they have a multiplicity of power. In other words, the universe, we both understand that the universe seems to be chaotic. Things seem to happen without any, I don't know why it happened. That earthquake, it just came on, and, half of my family is gone. And the people came and warred against this. This is terrible. Why does this happen? And so every culture has to try to answer these difficult questions. The Bible has a very particular way of answering these questions. In Mesopotamia, the gods are not the sum total of all the power of existence. We'll talk about this with the creation epic and the created order, but the gods, so creation starts off in Mesopotamia. The word creation doesn't even make sense. Matter is eternal. Everything starts off with matter. It's kind of like Transformers. There was this all sparked or whatever you call it. And by the way, that's all after my time, but I did have kids. So, so, so matter begins, and the gods stem from matter, and so they understand that even the most powerful God in the universe does not have the sum total of all the power of the universe, and he's actually from matter. It's not the other way around. And personality comes from impersonality, and all the gods together have to abide by what you might call fate. This is not unlike ancient Greece and ancient Rome in terms of their understanding of the gods. And so if I'm a divine being and you're just a human, you're going to worship me because you're really scared of me. And I'm probably 100 times more powerful than you are, but I still have my own failings and I still have my own weaknesses. And I still have to subject myself to the order of creation, which, by the way, doesn't seem to have any personality or the like. Humans, by the way, are here to serve the divine order. Okay? And we'll read this in the Mesopotamian creation epic, where the gods have their own war, and it's very chaotic, and explains why there's evil and terrible things that happen on the earth. And then humans are an afterthought to basically do all the hard, dirty work the gods don't want to do. And so this is why our life really stinks. And of course, the Bible, it's no different in Israel. Israelites have really hard life too, but their God has a very different, answer to it. Is the God there is benevolent to us, but there is evil. So is he benevolent but just incompetent? No, he's benevolent, incompetent. And by the way, that's really complicated to figure that one out. And of course, it takes 80 hours of reading to figure it out, Genesis down to Revelation, to realize, oh, God actually has a plan to try to restore us back to that garden order. And it's actually pretty painful to have to go through it. And it's painful for him too. And of course, that's the incarnation and the cross and the whole thing. And so that's the biblical answer is complicated and in many respects unpleasant for humans, because we have to admit that we're part of the problem. Kind of like when anyway, never mind. But so we have to recognize that we're part of that problem. In Mesopotamia, it's just, we're slave beings to the gods. And of course, this is why when Moses talks to the Israelites in Genesis, he's saying, actually, though you are functionally slaves right now in Egypt, God made you to be kings, image bearers. And it's like, yeah, sure, Moses, did you see the chains I have on me? They're probably snickering at Moses for what he's writing, but he's saying, no, God actually made you for a different purpose than the one that's being used right now. You should have much higher self-esteem for you because you're an image bearer. You're not a slave like everybody else thinks on this planet. And the irony is, of course, he's telling this to slaves. Mm-hmm. Even the word Hebrew that is used seems to be a very, very low class, unpleasant term in the ancient Near East. We find it. And so the irony is, and so I look at it this way. The Israelites look like the rest of the people in the Near East, but when you scratch the surface and find out the meaning behind all of their cultural paraphernalia, it couldn't be more different.
Awesome. And that's what we'll be starting to look at next time with the creation account. So
fun.
Well, awesome. Well, this is great. Great episode. You answered some of my questions, left me with more than I asked.
Good.
But that's to be expected. So,
and hopefully for you too.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, yeah, thank you again. And we'll catch all of you next time on the beginning of creation.